This is Winchester Academy.
So let's give a warm Waupaca welcome to a new London boy, Tim Crain.
Thank you very much, Jack, and thanks so much to the Winchester Academy for the invitation for this evening, and to Dr. and Mrs. Rhodes for sponsoring this lecture. It's great to be back in Wisconsin, and indeed my parents are both from New London. And I was just saying that when I was a kid growing up, I'd been in Waupaca before, 2 different times when my cousins were playing for the New London Bulldogs. And it was over the course of alternating years that I was here. So it was still the Waupaca Comets in the early 1970s. So I was here at the football stadium too. So I was driving in, I recognized everything today. Absolutely everything. But it's wonderful to be here. And the Winchester Academy got its name. Driving to New London as a Milwaukee kid, coming up on Friday nights, he always drove through Winchester. So I didn't realize that until this afternoon, that there was that there was a combination or a connection there. Well, what I'd like to do this evening is to talk in terms of the United States experience in the Middle East. And what we're going to do is it's going to be more of a Cliff Notes version, because it's a tremendous amount of material that we're going to be looking to cover. But you're going to notice, indeed, a number of themes. And in this age of perhaps political polarization in this nation, if there's a silver lining to it, it really doesn't matter if it's a Democrat or a Republican in the White House. Historically, the foreign policy follows a very, very similar path. A very similar path. Tremendous trials and tribulations here for the American experience in the Middle East. And what we're going to try to do this evening is to have a better idea in terms of the past, in terms of helping us as well in the present and projecting onwards to the future. So to formally begin, what we're looking at here is a situation for the United States that it will inherit, in fact. It's going to inherit a scenario that proved, in fact, to be something that it really, really little control over ultimately. And what I mean specifically is to go all the way back to the early 20th century. The region would be more commonly known as the Ottoman Empire. An empire that came into existence in 1453, would last all the way until the end of World War I in 1918. Well, in the Ottoman Empire here at this time, what you have is the majority of the population are Arabs. The minority of the population are, in fact, Turks. The historic centerpiece, the city of Istanbul, was the centerpiece here of the Ottoman Empire, the capital city of the nation of Turkey in the present day. And although the Turks were the minority population, they nevertheless called all the shots. They basically ruled the roost here right on across the board. Well, from the standpoint of the British and the French, the 2 great imperial powers of the 19th century, they were watching the situation here very, very close in the Ottoman Empire. And the reason being is that in the late 19th century, British and French scientists were convinced. They were convinced that there was a great deal of oil. There was a great deal of oil here in this area of the Ottoman world, in particular the region of the Persian Gulf. And for these modernizing, industrializing nations, this was something that was very significant indeed. 2 areas, 2 great nations that suffered, both of them, from a lack of natural resources, unlike the United States. Well, the British and the French also knew, Britain in particular, of the politics going on in the Ottoman Empire, and they knew here that the Arabs were the majority of the population, yet they were treated as second-class citizens. The Turks, the minority, they were calling all the shots. And this would be something that could, in fact, come into use at some point a little bit later as far as Britain was concerned. Well, World War I begins in 1914, kicking off what would make the 20th century the most destructive century in all of human history. Take into consideration the following fact. In the 20th century alone, more people died in warfare in the 20th century than died in all 5,000 years of recorded history before it combined. We think we've come so far. Obviously, technology has changed and improved a great deal, especially with the onset of the Industrial Revolution, the continuation of the technological revolution. Human nature hasn't changed all that much, unfortunately and sadly. Well, World War I would take the lives of 15 million people. 15 million people, making it the single most destructive event in all of human history up to that time. And as the war begins, the Ottoman Empire ends up. It ends up here on the side. It ends up on the side of Germany and the Central Powers. And being on the side of Germany and the Central Powers, the war will be won or lost on the Western Front. All's less quiet on the Western Front, or so the saying went at the conclusion formally of the war. But the Western Front would pit Britain and France on one side against Germany on the other. But there were these other nations as well here going on and joining either the Allied side or the Central Power side. The United States proclaims its strict neutrality at the start of World War I. Well, our focus this evening is going to be more so in terms of what is happening. What is happening here is our map of World War I is up, what is happening in the Ottoman Empire. And what the British and the French decide to do is the Western Front here off to the left of our map debilitates in this stalemate. Is they decide they want to go after these weaker European nations that are part of Germany and the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire. And the British and the French try here first to knock out the Ottoman Turks in what was known as this Mesopotamian campaign, fails and fails miserably. A greater failure happened the next year in 1915 with the onset of the Battle of Gallipoli. Huge victory for the Ottoman Turks, embarrassing defeat for Britain and France and their imperial forces. What Britain decides, therefore, is to try and destroy the Ottoman Empire from within. Because they know damn well the majority of the population, the Arabs, are unhappy. And what they want here, what they want for the Arab population in the Ottoman world to rise up in open rebellion. And in exchange, if they do this, in exchange here, what they will grant after World War I, this great war is over, is independence to all of these different Arab states. Well, they contact through their British Governor General in Egypt, here as World War I is going on, Henry McMahon, to contact the Emir of Mecca, who is this great voice of Arab nationalism, Sharif Hussein, and the two of them are going to go back and forth here, wheeling and dealing. And what the British respond, or basically put forth in what is known as the Hussein-McMahon correspondence, is they ask Sharif Hussein, this voice of Arab nationalism, to get the Arabs to rise in open rebellion, to rise here in open rebellion, and overthrow the Ottoman Turks. It's like, in essence, launching a civil war within the Ottoman Empire. To do what the British and the French were having a hell of a hard time doing, and that was to defeat the Ottoman Empire. Well, Sharif Hussein wants it spelled out. What nations or what areas here are we talking about? And the Arabs are demanding independence for Saudi Arabia, for Jordan, for Iraq, Palestine, and Syria. Well, the British respond back in terms of these areas. They said, okay, you can have Saudi Arabia and Jordan and Iraq and Palestine, no problem. But Syria, nah. Syria is not going to be part of an independent movement. And the Arabs ask why. And the British say, well, because there's not an Arab majority there, which was true. But the real reason why the British couldn't promise Syria as part of the deal was due to the fact that the British had already promised secretly in the Sykes-Picot Agreement to make Syria a French colony after the war. So if you tell the Arabs that you're going to have here Syria as a French colony, all bets would be off. The Arabs aren't going to help you. So finally what they conclude is, let's just hold Syria off till the end of the war. So it's Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Iraq, and Palestine. All these independent states will be formally carved out. Syria we'll talk about later. Well, the Arabs, therefore, in 1916 are going to rise up in open rebellion against the Turks here in the Ottoman Empire. And they will be able to do here over the course of 1916 and 1917 what the British and the French could not do. That is really destroy the Ottoman Turkish resistance as part of the Central Powers in World War I. Meanwhile, Britain is going to make another advance booking. And in November of 1917, Britain is going to announce from a former Prime Minister, Arthur Balfour, a member of the Conservative Party, the Balfour Declaration. And on the 25th of November 1917, the Balfour Declaration stresses, coming from the British government, His Majesty's support for a Jewish state in Palestine. Well, from the standpoint of the Arabs, the Arabs said, what the hell? You promised that Palestine was going to be an independent Arab state. Now you're saying that you support a Jewish state in Palestine. And in a typical British diplomatic fashion, the response was, oh, don't worry, we'll sort it all out after the war. Well, you got to be careful. You're promising here a tract of land, or so it seems, same nation, Britain, to two very different groups, quite frankly. Well, the war continues, and eventually with the United States joining the side here of the Allies. What happens is that in this war of goods, eventually the scales will tip in favor of the Allies. And on November 11th, 1918, or the 11th day of the 11th month at 11 a.m., 1918, Germany agrees to the terms of the armistice, and World War I officially comes to an end. Well, from the standpoint of the Paris Peace Conference, and stepping into a map of today, what the British are going to do, 99% of the lines that are drawn on the map of the Middle East in the present day were drawn at the Paris Peace Conference all the way back in 1919 by Britain. The big three, Britain, France, the United States. The United States was more the Johnny-come-lately to the war, not joining until April 6 of 1917. What happens here is Britain is going to be calling the shots for the Middle East because the French aren't that interested, and the Americans are really more on this isolationist mentality, which they had been, going all the way back to the end of the American Civil War in 1865. Well, what Britain will do is it's going to grant here independence to Saudi Arabia, 1919. However, with Iraq, it is going to make Iraq, it's going to put it under a mandate status, which is basically a protectorate. What does that mean? What that means here is that eventually Iraq will become independent. The question isn't one of if, it's a question of when, but not for the time being. But then they're going to take the most oil-rich region out of Iraq, the 19th province, Kuwait, and they're going to carve the most oil-rich region out of Iraq, and they're going to form an independent British colony, the nation of Kuwait, which remains a British colony all the way until 1961. Oh, the Iraqis are not happy. Not by any stretch. And furthermore, you have Sunnis and Shiites, you've got Kurds. It's kind of like this dysfunctional entity right out of the gate. By the same end, Jordan will be placed under a British mandate. So Iraq's a British mandate, Jordan's a British mandate, Palestine a British mandate. Until the British can figure out what to do, because they recognize, okay, we made promises or agreements with two very different groups of people. In this regard, therefore, the only nation that will be granted its formal independence is Saudi Arabia. Iraq mandate, Jordan mandate, Palestine mandate, Kuwait British colony. Syria is going to become a French colony. As far as the Arabs were concerned, the British and the French were blatantly dishonest. We don't have what they told us we were going to have. And to make a bad situation worse, in Palestine it's complete chaos. It's complete chaos because the Jewish population is anticipating an independent Jewish state of Israel, and the Arab population is anticipating here an independent Arab state of Palestine. Well, in Iraq, civil war erupts. As the Sunnis and the Shiites and the Kurds here are all struggling for the upper hand, Britain's going to have to send in more and more forces. Syria is also a complete mess here in the interwar period. As the Syrians, particularly in the city of Damascus, they didn't want to be a French colony. How did this happen? They're going to rise up in open rebellion as well against the French. The French are going to resort to aerial bombardment of the city of Damascus, and over 40,000 Syrian civilians are going to perish here in the 1930s. Oh, let's just say the honeymoon didn't last all that long. It is very, very bad. It's not a good situation here at all, not by any stretch of the imagination. And Britain and France, by the late 1930s, realized something far more serious is at hand than these problems in the Middle East. And that is the war clouds here rolling across historic Europe for a second time. And the very real prospects of World War II. Well, the Second World War is going to take the lives of 62 million people, making it the single most destructive event in all of human history. 62 million dead in this war. But if ever there was such a thing as a just war, World War II was it. No doubt about this. This corrosive evil of Nazi Germany had to be stopped here in the European theater, and it's going to become, in the aftermath of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, truly a world war from the standpoint of the European theater, which was already established in September of 1939, and now the Pacific theater, beginning officially December of 1941, December 7th. Well, for these nations involved in World War II, the British and the French are desperately trying to hold on. France is going to be defeated, forced to unconditionally surrender to the Germans on June 22nd, 1940. The fall of France, the shock of the entire world. Still very, very bizarre as military historians look back at this time period. Britain, under the leadership of the excellent Winston Churchill, will hold this nation together against all odds, holding on and holding out, promising here revenge on Germany for the aerial bombardment where over 80,000 British civilians will be killed in the fall of 1940 alone. Eventually, with the United States' entrance into this war, World War II became, just like World War I, this war of goods. Which side could outproduce the other? And even though the United States is going to fall headlong into the Great Depression in 1929, and it takes all the way until 1943 for this nation to come out of it, eventually it does. Eventually here, it in fact does. And with the end of World War II, with victory for the Allies, the big three being the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, the U.S. is going to inherit the situation formerly in the Middle East. Take into consideration the following point. In 1945, the United States made up 6% of the world's population. 6% of the world's population. It controlled 75% of the world's capital and 63% of the world's industry. Wow! Never before in the course of human history would one nation be in a position of total and complete domination as the United States was in 1945. Really, it began in 1915 in the backdrop of World War I. Henry Luce of Time magazine referred to the 20th century as the American century, pointing backwards to the 19th century being the British century. I'd say that was a very, very fair assessment, very accurate assessment. The United States is the only nation at the end of World War II that emerges virtually unscathed. This is true not just of the victorious Allied powers that suffered tremendously, it is also true of the defeated Axis powers, Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, Fascist Italy, etc. Well, for the U.S., obviously economically, it is a superpower. By the same token, economically it's a superpower, it is also a military superpower. Britain and France are virtually bankrupt. Britain and France here are virtually bankrupt. Even though Britain emerges victorious on the side of the Allies, France is going to come back in the aftermath of the invasion of D-Day, June 6, 1944, with Charles de Gaulle and the Free French troops. These two nations, these two great imperial powers from the 19th century, recognize the fact it's been more of a reduction into second-class standing. The issue here for the Middle East, what the British make abundantly clear to the Americans, as well as the French, is that they're leaving. They're leaving. They're withdrawing here from these areas, from this region. And they are doing this because, quite frankly, they have to dismantle their two respective empires. The British could boast that the sun never set on the British Empire. Indeed, it didn't. Well, those days are over. And the dismantling of the empire here after World War II had to formally take place. Well, for the United States, for the U.S., it is going to step in. It is going to step in here, and what will dominate U.S. foreign policy is that you'll be dealing with, when these new independent states now come to the surface, autocracy. And what I mean by autocracy is iron-fisted rule. Iron-fisted rule. These autocracies could be militaristic, as is what is going to come forth in nations like Egypt, with Gamal Abdel Nasser and Anwar Sadat and Hosni Mubarak, a chain here of militaristic autocrats. Saddam Hussein of Iraq, another autocratic militarist. Or monarchical autocracies. The House of Saud in Saudi Arabia. Classic case example, King Hussein in Jordan, monarchical autocrat. The Shah of Iran, monarchical autocrat, here going back to the 1950s. The alternatives seem to be theocracies. And theocracies were something which would be a rule here by religion that you're best set in terms of avoiding. History has proven that political fanaticism is far less dangerous than religious fanaticism. If there's a silver lining to that at all, I'm not entirely sure. But this represented here for the US some very significant challenges. And the Americans wanted to learn from the mistakes here of the British and the French. Well, why were the Americans going there? Isolationism was dead. Dead on arrival. It was dead on arrival, to be perfectly frank with you, in 1915. It was dead in 1945. It's dead in the present day. Impossible. Plain and simple. For the US, there are concerns here. As the economic superpower of the world, the United States, concerned in the Middle East, first and foremost, economic. You had here a great deal of interest in terms of oil, plain and simple. Now, the area in particular, the Persian Gulf, you want to get the attraction or the attention, I should say, of the United States like that, have something big going down in one of these four nations, up to and including the present day. Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia. Just like that. The United States does not get and never has received the bulk of its oil from this region. It doesn't. And it hasn't. But its allies in Western Europe, eventually Japan, they all do. So it's something here that is indeed very significant. So the first reason why the United States is going to get itself involved in the Middle East is economic. The second reason is the Cold War. The Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, granted, these two nations during World War II, they made very strange bed partners, to be perfectly frank. Joseph Stalin was a murderous tyrant, plain and simple. Plain and simple. His nation during World War II is going to suffer more than any nation has ever suffered in human history. Out of 32 million dead in World War II on the Allied side, 32 million dead on the Allied side, the Soviet Union loses nearly 30 million lives. The Soviet Union also suffers $464 billion worth of damage in World War II. John Kennedy, in a speech of 1961, talked about Soviet destruction in World War II. He said, picture the Mississippi River as the Great Divide here. Now picture everything East Americans of the Mississippi River completely flattened. That was the level of destruction in Soviet Russia here in World War II. What the Germans did to them was horrific. The Soviets returned. The horrors here near the tail end of World War II on the Germans, there was no doubt about that. So it's for these two reasons that's falling out. The Soviets first are freaked out. They want to dominate Eastern Europe, setting up these puppet states. This was made clear at the Yalta Conference to Franklin Roosevelt. He agrees to it in fairness to the Soviets, though he doesn't like it. But what happens here is when Roosevelt dies on April 12, 1945, his successor, Harry Truman, is completely opposed to it. And the concern here is that the Soviets are going to start trying to push in the Middle East. In 1947, Harry Truman passes what becomes known as the Truman Doctrine. As the Cold War between the US and the Soviets is heating up. And the Truman Doctrine stresses that the United States will defend any nation anywhere in the world that is opposed here to communism. Well, what happens here in terms of the Middle East is the United States knows it has to be very careful. It has to be very, very careful. Because the United States, especially Harry Truman, recognizes that the majority of the population in the Middle East, the Arab world, economically is intertwined with the United States, but even more so with American allies. By the same token, Harry Truman is very sympathetic to the plight of the European Jews. take into consideration the following fact. In the 20th century alone, for every 2 Jews who have been born in this world, the 20th century alone, for every 2 Jews who have been born, 1 of them has been murdered. What does that say about the darker side of the human condition? One of my favorite quotes of all regarding anti-Semitism is, anti-Semitism is due to 2 things: the Jews and the bicyclists. You say, why the bicyclists? The answer is, why the Jews? The stupidity of it all. The darker side of the human condition. Well, in the aftermath of World War II, there's 200,000 Jewish survivors of Hitler's death camps and concentration camps who wanted to gain access to Palestine. The British had sealed the borders of Palestine in 1939 because there was a low-grade civil war between the Arabs and the Jews already going on. It really had been in effect since 1920. And they thought by letting in more Jews, you're going to have a full-blown civil war. Harry Truman intervenes, very much an idealist, and he encourages the British to wash their hands of it by turning this entire matter of Palestine over to the UN. And the United Nations comes up with a 2-state solution. It's going to be a Jewish state of Israel and an Arab state of Palestine. The Jewish state of Israel is going to be, for the most part, desert. You can see right here on our map. The Arab state of Palestine is going to be these areas here, what is the present-day West Bank and Gaza, for the most part. The Palestinian Jews accept the partition plan. The Palestinian Arabs reject it. And in 1948, the nation of Israel proclaims its birth, May of 1948. The United States immediately recognizes the birth of Israel. The Soviet Union is the second nation to recognize the birth of Israel just a few minutes after the Americans recognize it. Well, the problem here, it's going to further complicate the situation. Why? Because what was going to be a 2-state solution in Palestine actually ends up being a 1-state solution, Israel, with what was going to be the heart and soul of the state of Palestine, this Arab state controlled either by Egypt or by Jordan. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees end up in these camps. The United Nations is going to monitor. What the end product would be was anyone's guess. Although the United States recognizes the birth of Israel, it's going to keep this region at an arm's length. It's almost like, in a sense, to probably best describe American foreign policy in the Middle East. Here is they're going to be going it alone. After World War II, is to quote Teddy Roosevelt, speak softly but carry a big stick. You're going to operate behind the scenes as much as possible. You're not going to get into this like the British and the French did here in the interwar period and get yourself pulled into all sorts of conflict. Well, the Americans will keep this area at an arm's length. Following Harry Truman's retirement from the presidency, Dwight Eisenhower, Republican from the state of Kansas, is going to take it over. And the Americans, with the help of the CIA, will help keep the Shah of Iran in power here in 1953. And the Shah will unleash his full-blown autocracy on the Iranian people, which wasn't good. The Shah of Iran is a thug, plain and simple, a thug. And I don't mean that in a positive way. By the same end here, tens of thousands of Iranians would go missing over the course of the 1950s and the 1960s. And the hope on the part of the US government is that this will settle down eventually, and the Shah will become more of a voice of moderation. By the same end, the Eisenhower administration also intervened in Egypt in a very, very quiet fashion. For the Suez Crisis of 1956, Gamal Abdel Nasser, this military autocrat in Egypt, seized the Suez Canal that had been built going back to 1854 exclusively by the British and the French as a shortcut through the Red Sea and onwards into the Indian Ocean. Nasser wanted the canal. The British and the French wouldn't give it to him, so he seizes the canal. The British and the French are going to descend upon, take the canal back, and Eisenhower and the Americans intervene and tell the British and the French to get out. And they have no choice. The Americans are going to keep this area at an arm's length, being very, very careful. Very careful. monitoring matters closely, but it's almost more of a sense of behind the scenes. Well, as the 1960s continue, the situation is going to begin to change. It will, in fact, here begin to change. And in 1967, you probably just saw in terms of newspapers around the United States, June 5th of 1967, what you had here was an event known as the Six-Day War. The Six-Day War. Now, Israel and the Arab states, they'd gone to war a number of times already since the birth of the nation of Israel all the way back in 1948. And the war clouds appeared to be rolling across the Arab-Israeli landscape yet again. No surprise. No surprise. And Gamal Abdel Nasser, this prominent Arab nationalist, the president here of Egypt, Nasser begins to openly threaten Israel. And it appeared inevitable there was going to be another major war. Well, what Israel did in the early morning hours of June 5th, 1967, was to launch an all-out strike against Egypt, destroying here 90% of the Egyptian Air Force 50 years ago this month, before the Egyptian Air Force could even get off the ground. They then, Israel, are launching an attack into Egypt, deep into the Sinai. Well, Egyptian radio reports stress 2 hours after the invasion begins that the Egyptian army is now marching on Jerusalem, and soon Zionist-occupied Palestine, or Israel, will be destroyed. Well, when Syria and Jordan hear this, they're like, perfect. Let's join in the spoils. That's not what's happening. That's not happening. What's happening here is that Israel is soundly thumping Egypt. Well, Syria and Jordan are now going to declare war on Israel, believing here the erroneous radio reports. And the Israelis are going to push the Jordanians back, they're going to push the Syrians back, they're going to defeat the Egyptians, to the stage that just 6 days later, Israel, here it is in yellow, Israel here in yellow, a nation that I would say, quite frankly, is obsessed with security. We run a summer institute in Jerusalem. I've been there the last 3 Julys. It's about a 3.5-week institute, and the tension, especially in the old city of Jerusalem, between the two populations is quite striking, that's for sure. But what the Israelis do here is they take control of these Egyptian lands, Gaza and the Sinai, these blue territories. They take from the Jordanians the West Bank as well as East Jerusalem. They take from Syria Golan or Golan Heights. And the Israelis argue, we are holding on to these territories, these occupied territories, indefinitely, until you promise to leave us alone and you normalize relations with us. In other words, we sign peace treaties, we exchange ambassadors, etc. But when the American president, Lyndon Johnson, sees this, he's pretty amazed. I mean, Israel is like this little nation that had oranges and lemons. It wasn't all that powerful. Well, suddenly now, within a week, it's defeated 3 prominent Arab states. By the same token, the Americans are concerned because the Soviets are giving a good deal of military aid here in the Cold War to Egypt. They're doing the same to Syria. And what the Johnson administration sees is a strong nation of Israel in the U.S. best interests. American aid is going to start being pumped into the nation of Israel. This has to be seen as a backdrop of the Cold War. A strong Israel is a bulwark against Soviet expansionism in the Middle East. By the same token, the American government better be very careful, because you could suffer here an Arab backlash. It could lead to all sorts of problems. Well, for the time being here, it's the status quo. It is indeed the status quo. And Israel becomes the #1 aid recipient of U.S. aid in the world as of 1968, which it remains in the present day. Meanwhile, across the Sinai Desert, the replacement here to Gamal Abdel Nasser comes to power in Egypt, a gentleman by the name of Anwar Sadat. And Sadat, a military autocrat, sees here in the early 1970s the impact that American aid is having on Israel. Oh, it's helping big time. Sadat, by the same token, wants to establish a relationship between Egypt and the U.S. in a strikingly similar fashion. His predecessor, Nasser, had no interest. Sadat is different. So what Sadat does is he starts reaching out to the Nixon administration, here in 1972. Nixon and his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, they're not interested. Sadat's like, oh, it's because we just got our butts kicked in the 1967 war. By the same token, Sadat has 40,000 Soviet military advisors on Egyptian soil. Well, that could be part of the problem. So what he does 3 months after that, in 1972, is he expels these Soviet military advisors. They all leave. Maybe this will get the attention of the United States. The US could still care less. Anwar Sadat comes to the conclusion that the reason why the United States is uninterested is because they have Israel up on this pedestal, that it's this all-encompassing military power, and it's not. And what Sadat decides to do is to launch an all-out war against Israel. A war he knows he's going to lose. It's going to be known as the October War or the Yom Kippur War, October 6, 1973. Sadat is going to take the Egyptian army and drive it across the Sinai Peninsula. He does it on one of the Jewish holy days of Yom Kippur, one of the two biggies, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. This was Yom Kippur. He believes that he can catch a one-time resident of the city of Milwaukee, Golda Meir, who is now Prime Minister of Israel, off guard. Oh yeah, catches him off guard big time. Big time. And this historic crossing is wildly successful in the first 48 hours. Eventually, though, the Israelis rebound. They drive. The Egyptians all the way back across the Sinai. A ceasefire is called. The United States and the Soviet Union get involved here. The United Nations is involved here. And what happens is that as far as the Arab states are concerned, they've had enough of the US. Because the United States is blatantly favoring Israel in this conflict. And what the Arab states decide to do is to hit the Americans where they'll feel it the most. And these oil-producing exporting countries, known more commonly as OPEC, what happens here is that the OPEC nations of the Middle East are going to get together. And they're going to announce that they are limiting their oil exports 1% each week indefinitely to the Western world. Every single week, for as long as Israel remains in those occupied territories or those blue territories. Saudi Arabia, that had a close working relationship with the United States going all the way back to the 1920s, Saudi Arabia announces it is cutting off the United States for all oil effective immediately. I can remember this. Remember back in 1973, the gas lines? Back in the good old days when gas was like 62 cents a gallon. Right. And those big old, I can remember we had a 73 Impala. You could fit like a family of 11 in there. I was the youngest of the family. I think I was kind of an oops at the end. So my spot in the Impala was up in the back window. And that slanted window, my face was pressed against the glass. My sister Connie said, "Shut up, we're almost home." Well, in this case, remember, gas rationing was like, oh my God, what's going on? You want to get the attention of the United States? Oh, the OPEC embargo did. Henry Kissinger goes off on this whirlwind tour. He goes off here on this whirlwind tour. It's very, very common in the Middle East is that it doesn't matter, males, females, you kiss each other on the cheek. It's a kindness, it's a gesture of peace. So he goes first to Anwar Sadat, Henry Kissinger. And he gets off the plane and he kisses Anwar Sadat on the cheek, both sides of the cheek. Very nice, very kind. King Hussein of Jordan, more the same. Okay. Kiss on both sides of the cheek. He visits Saudi Arabia. King Ibn Saud is kissed by Henry Kissinger on both cheeks. Now he's off to Tel Aviv. Golda Meir is waiting for him. Henry Kissinger comes down the walkway, kisses Golda Meir on both cheeks, and she looks at him and she said, "Oh, Mr. Secretary of State, I didn't know that you kissed girls too." Well, what Kissinger was out to do is to lift this damn OPEC embargo, because this is unacceptable. The United States is a superpower economically and militarily. How in God's name can this be happening? And as far as the Arab states are concerned, you do nothing to resolve this conflict here with Israel. All you care about is the almighty dollar. and we're making this abundantly clear. The Nixon administration's response was, hey, listen, we hear you loud and clear. Tell you what, lift this embargo, and the United States will play this role of peacemaker. It'll play the role of honest broker. The embargo is lifted. And the US starts moving forward, first with Richard Nixon, then with his successor, Gerald Ford, all the way through to Jimmy Carter. And what the Americans do after this 1973 war is they start pouring economic aid into Egypt. By 1974, Egypt is the #2 recipient of US aid in the world. It remains #2 in the world in the present day, just behind Israel. It's kind of a 1-2 punch. And what the Americans start doing is they start leaning on the Egyptians. They start leaning on Anwar Sadat to reach out to Israel, because the belief on the part of the US diplomats was that if you can forge a peace agreement between Egypt and Israel, it could have a domino effect. Very, very positive movement across the entire area, across the entire region. It's definitely worth it. Why? Because Egypt was the creme de la creme in the Arab world. And the Egyptians would be the first to let you know that. So Jimmy Carter is going to bring these two historic enemies, Anwar Sadat of Egypt, the Israeli Prime Minister, Menachem Begin. Together, he will personally get involved in the peace process. And the issue here wasn't so much in terms of working through of normalizing relations. Egypt and Israel are going to sign a peace agreement at Camp David, 1979. They're going to exchange ambassadors, etc. The Sinai Peninsula, the Sinai Desert, the largest of all the occupied territories, will be given back state as section after section after section to be returned completely to Egypt by 1983, which it was. And the net result here, what's left, is Gaza, the West Bank, and Golan. But what Menachem Begin is planning was not a good idea, saying this in terms of diplomatic history, was to start building Jewish settlements in Gaza and the West Bank. And what his plan was eventually was to annex these territories. These territories are 100% Palestinian Arab. This is going to be difficult as all hell to do. And what's happening with the Palestinian Arabs in Gaza and the West Bank, if you're building here these settlements by the hundreds, eventually the thousands, how serious are you about actually leaving these lands? This was going to be the heart and soul of the state of Palestine here in the 1970s and onwards into the 1980s. Not a good situation. Not a good situation at all. Well, as the 1970s continued, what the Americans kept looking for, they're playing this role of honest broker. They're looking to stabilize the area. And Jimmy Carter is very optimistic. Well, the optimism here was short-lived. Because in 1979, the Iranian Revolution takes place. Now, the Iranians, not to further complicate matters, they're not Arabs. They're Persians. They don't practice the form that most Muslims practice in terms of Islam, Sunni Islam. They're Shiite Muslims. So they're Persian Shiites, whereas the rest of the world in the Middle East overwhelmingly are Sunni Arabs. Well, in this regard, in 1979, all hell breaks loose in Iran. The Shah, who had been this iron-fisted autocrat, was encouraged by the Carter administration to start implementing some humanitarian reforms. Here's the scoop. Here it is in a nutshell. The most dangerous time for a bad government is not when a bad government remains bad. In other words, if you're corrupt as hell, you're better off staying corrupt as hell. Reason being, the most dangerous time is when a bad government begins to reform for the good. You open that window of reform, that whole wall can come collapsing right down on you. And the US government was all too well aware of the humanitarian abuses here, these human rights abuses launched by the Shah. And they encouraged him to lift press censorship. They encouraged him to lift that you can't be more than 10 people out in Tehran in the streets at any given time because it could be mob rule. The Shah doesn't want to do it. He doesn't. Well, he gets overthrown. And the Shah is going to be replaced here by a theocratic voice, the Ayatollah Khomeini, along with the more moderate voice, Hasan Bani-Sadr. They had been together in exile in Paris.
And what Khomeini was doing is writing these vicious diatribes going all the way back to 1962 against the Shah of Iran for being a thug and a tyrant, and against the United States for having propped him up. For having propped him up. He was their puppet. It's not good. And when the Carter administration, which I would argue here was probably more than guilt, you could ask Jimmy Carter, I don't know what he'd say in the present day about it, allowed for the Shah to come to New York for cancer treatment, that did it, because the Iranians wanted him back to stand trial as a criminal. And when the Americans refused to deport the Shah, the US Embassy is stormed. We remember that all too well. And what happens here economically, you think Iran has hostility towards the United States in the present day? Woo! It's nothing compared to the hostility the United States has towards Iran. The US is going to lose billions upon billions of dollars, as too would be the case with the British and the French. The largest corporation in the world at one time in the early 1950s, the AIOC, the Anglo-Iranian oil company, this British oil company, operated as a state within a state outside of Tehran. Suddenly here it is a very, very difficult situation. And you have the birth of a theocracy. Oh God, avoid the theocracies like they were the plague. Well, unfortunately now, for US foreign policy, you've got one. And by the same token, for the United States, here in the 1980s, they start to look at the situation and try and find ways that, from the American standpoint, if we step in, doesn't matter, Democrats or Republicans, sometimes we might make things better. Then again, we might make it 3 times worse. So it becomes this question of what to do. You find yourself by the 1980s reacting to things. The largest conventional war since World War II begins between Iran and Iraq, 2 nations that bitterly despise one another. The centerpiece and the reason for the war was the Ayatollah Khomeini, who was encouraging the Shiites in Iraq to rise in open rebellion against Saddam Hussein, this military autocrat and his Ba'athist party that had been in power since 1974. The United States is going to stay on the sidelines in the Reagan administration, closely monitoring the situation. By the same token, the Soviet Union is going to intervene in the midst of a civil war in Afghanistan between the Afghan Marxists and the Muslim holy warriors, as the Americans refer to them as, more commonly known as the Mujahideen. In this titanic struggle, the United States will send money to the Mujahideen. One of the most prominent of those leaders here in this organization was a very well-to-do Saudi gentleman by the name of Osama bin Laden. Again, it shows the difficulties, the challenges for US foreign policy. One time, that guy could end up being, fairly allied with you. The other time, he could become a tremendous enemy. Well, over the course of the 1980s, the US watched closely. They kept here the Palestinians and the Israelis at an arm's length. It seemed to be a lose-lose situation. And by the same end, they looked continually, if possible, to stabilize this very unstable region. You find yourself, Democrat, Republican, reacting to what's going on there. And as the Iran-Iraq war wound down, as the Iran-Iraq war here formally wound down, looked like it was going to be a stalemate. Saddam Hussein, he has no money. He traveled to Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, these 2 fellow Arab states, and he asked them for $90 billion alone to help him fight against the Ayatollah Khomeini and the Iranians. The Kuwaitis and the Saudis agreed. They gave him here this $90 billion. It didn't make a damn bit of difference. And by 1989, the Iran-Iraq war is officially over. Stalemate, truce, nothing. Well, Saddam Hussein owes $90 billion, this Iraqi strongman, to Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, and he asked them, hey, in the interest of Arab Brotherhood, could you forgive the debt? And the response coming from the Kuwaitis and the Saudis was, no, a deal was a deal. This wasn't a gift in the interest of Arab Brotherhood. This was a loan. You owe us the money. Saddam Hussein doesn't have the money. And on August 1st, 1990, Hussein is going to launch an all-out invasion against Kuwait, knowing he can easily defeat Kuwait and take control of that nation, what he sees as nothing more than an extension of British imperialism, because it had been here, this British colony, the most oil-rich region of all, the Iraqi 19th province. In fairness, if you had polled your average Iraqi in 1990, they would have agreed with him. Kuwait falls like a house of cards. Immediately, George H.W. Bush, or George Bush Sr., recognizes here the danger. Because from the concern on the part of the United States, remember going back to our map, you want to get the attention of the Americans like this. Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia. Well, Iran's gone, we know that. Not even on speaking terms. There's open hostility between the Americans and the Iranians. Now you have Iraq invading Kuwait. The Americans can't trust Saddam Hussein, the US government. And now there's a very strong likelihood, this wasn't propaganda, it was reality, that next he'd roll into Saudi Arabia and easily overthrow the House of Saud. George H.W. Bush, therefore, calls for, in August of 1990, Operation Desert Shield. He sends over 200,000 Americans immediately to get into the Persian Gulf, to get here on Saudi soil, to set up here the shield so that Saudi Arabia doesn't get invaded. This works, and in the interim, he goes to the United Nations, and he calls here for a UN force to liberate Kuwait. Now, when this happens, once again, the Arab world steps forth. And the Arab world said, okay, you care so much about the Kuwaitis. And to be honest with you, most of the Arab states can't stand the Kuwaitis. They hate the Kuwaitis. Kuwaitis are also Arabs. It's a long story we could say for a different day. So they really didn't care. But the attitude is the Americans care so much about Kuwait, whereas they don't do a damn thing regarding the Palestinians and the Israelis, and they could play a very prominent role in this. George Bush stresses, I hear you loud and clear, once Kuwait is liberated, the United States will do all it can to bring about peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis. Well, what happens here is, we remember, January of 1991, Operation Desert Storm begins with the aerial bombardment. I can remember Congressman Les Aspin from Wisconsin was saying, Iraq has no way of defending themselves. This is going to be fairly easy. From the aerial bombardment, it's not going to last long. And he was criticized by his fellow Democrats for giving the rosiest of rosy portrayals. Well, war can be very unpredictable. There's no doubt about that. But Les Aspin was correct. Once the ground troops are sent in, 72, 96 hours later, it's basically over. Mission accomplished. Mission accomplished here in this regard with Operation Desert Storm. George H.W. Bush knew that you got to get out of there as quick as possible, because the mere presence of Western troops on Saudi Arabian soil, the birthplace of the religion of Islam, what you're going to do is you're going to add fuel to the fire of Islamic extremism, who represent, in fairness, 5% of the Islamic world. 5%. They're portrayed in the media as just a bunch of brainwashed zealots. It's ridiculous. And time again, with these pathetic cowards, I don't care if you're talking Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda or Hezbollah, time and time again, when these actions are committed, these strikes are committed, these murders are committed, they are completely condemned throughout the Islamic world. And that needs to be reported more, plain and simple. Well, what happens here? George H.W. Bush knows this is going to be fuel to the fire, because the holiest of holy cities for the Muslims, first and foremost, Mecca. Second, Medina. They're both in Saudi Arabia. Number 3, Jerusalem. The third most holy city. The holiest city for Judaism. Jerusalem, also the holiest city for Christianity. Number 3 for the Muslims. Well, in this regard, the United States is going to start moving forward and start working once again with peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And what the Americans realize, what they know crystal clear, is the same thing that the Palestinians and the Israelis know. The end of the road. These two sides cannot get along. They can't live together, plain and simple. And what's going to happen between the Israelis and the Palestinians is going to be a divorce, a nasty divorce. You're going to see a Palestinian state coming forth in Gaza, and the West Bank in some form or another, and the nation of Israel obviously will remain exactly as the way it is at present. The issue is then, because of one of East Jerusalem, what's going to happen there. Everybody knows what the end of the road looks like between these two communities. I hear this from them all the time in Jerusalem. It is all over but the body count. If this would have been 10 years ago, I would have stood up in front of all of you and I would have bet my life that there was going to be peace between these two communities in my lifetime. I can still bet my life that there's going to be peace between these two communities, but I don't think I'm going to live to see it. Well, from the standpoint here of the United States, indeed, the concern was this rise of extremism. Coming forth from the nation of Iran, you have this Shiite theocracy. Avoid it like the plague. In Afghanistan, eventually in the aftermath of the Afghan Civil War, the Soviets are defeated. The Red Army is withdrawn by Mikhail Gorbachev in this policy or glasnost or openness, the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union in the 1980s. But what you have is a theocracy coming forth, coming to power eventually in Afghanistan, the Taliban. From the standpoint of the United States, two of its close allies in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia and Egypt, are ranked among two of the 5 worst nations in the world in terms of human rights and human rights abuses. Nothing to be proud of. And I remember it all too well, Condoleezza Rice. Some years ago, during the George W. Bush administration, she was paying lip service to the need for human rights in two of our close allied nations, Saudi Arabia and Egypt, to be recognized, to be respected. And if history makes you anything, it makes you a passionate humanitarian. But the bottom line is, I don't care if it's a Democrat or a Republican in the White House, you're not going to push. You're not going to push Saudi Arabia and the autocratic House of Saud. Why? Because if you push too far, you could end up with the Wahhabis, the religious freaks, coming to power, which would make the king of Saudi Arabia look like Rebecca of Donnybrook Farm. Similar situation. Hosni Mubarak is overthrown in the Arab Spring in 2011. Silence coming from the Obama administration. Absolute silence. Exactly the way to respond. The Muslim Brotherhood, you don't want them coming to power. You don't want the religious fanatics in power. Remember, religious zealotry is far more difficult to control than political fanaticism. The US is doing the right thing, plain and simple. Be careful. Oh yes, the situation may improve, but it may get worse. Over the course here of the late 1990s, the Clinton administration was closely monitoring an organization that was born in the backdrop of the Mujahideen, in the 1980s in the war in Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda here, headed by Osama bin Laden, was looking in essence to create almost something of this religious-dominated, quasi-religious movement across the entire Middle East. It doesn't have a snowball's chance in hell of working. You have too small of a population that would be interested in such a thing, even though you have here a theocracy in Afghanistan as well as Iran. The Clinton administration is closely monitoring al-Qaeda as it's launching these terrorist strikes against American positions, the USS Cole, etc. And Saudi Arabia forces al-Qaeda out. They go to Sudan. The US government under Clinton sends word to Sudan, if something big happens, we're holding you responsible because we know al-Qaeda's on your soil. The Sudanese government forces here al-Qaeda out to Afghanistan. The same warning is given. The same warning here is formally given to the government of Afghanistan, to the Taliban. And on September 11, 2001, a day that would last in infamy, the next generation's Pearl Harbor, 4 planes are hijacked here by 19 hijackers, these al-Qaeda operatives. 16 of the 19 are from Saudi Arabia. Egypt is going to represent the final 3. And what happens is these planes, of course, are crashed into the Twin Towers, as well as the Pentagon. The 4th plane crashes in a field in Pennsylvania. Its destination was either the White House or the Capitol. And the response on the part of the new president, George W. Bush, it was a no-brainer, absolute no-brainer. And that was to invade here Afghanistan. The Taliban's going down. The Americans knew this wasn't going to be easy. You didn't have a choice. I don't care who's in the White House. The same would have been the response. It's not a George W. Bush thing here in Afghanistan. The Taliban's going to be overthrown. The Americans know all too well the lessons of the Soviet Red Army. It's not going to be an easy future, not by any stretch. However, shortly after, George W. Bush sets up here this axis of evil: Iran, Iraq, North Korea, and begins to argue that Iraq was behind September 11th. Now, in terms of Middle Eastern history, this would make zero sense. Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein would hate each other with a passion. Complete polar opposites. By the same token, is the argument of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. What was being used to describe weapons of mass destruction that could pertain to over 40% of the nations on this planet. George H.W. Bush refused categorically to invade Iraq, the father of George W. Bush, on the plan that there was no exit strategy and that it would be chaos and it would look like US imperialism. His son sees things differently in the aftermath of September 11th. To be perfectly frank with you, in March of 2003, when the United States is now going to launch a second strike in Iraq, what I assumed is going to happen was large-scale civil war between the Sunnis and the Shiites and the Kurds, going right back to what the British had at their hands in the 1920s and the 1930s. What it did, however, is it served to further destabilize an already very unstable region. And coming forth from this would be yet another theocratic movement. I'm oftentimes asked publicly, what do you think the plan was of George W. Bush's administration if obviously there was no link with September 11th, which the administration eventually admitted, and of course there were no weapons of mass destruction? Most likely, and I can't prove this, but most likely I think the United States was setting up a permanent military presence outside of Baghdad, the Green Zone, as a way to respond to problems in this very unstable region. So you don't have to remember the Persian Gulf War. George H.W. Bush was like, okay, Saddam, you've got 5 months to get out of Kuwait. Why? Well, because he had to manufacture here a large enough force on Saudi Arabian soil to launch into this. So to make it easier to respond. That was probably what the ultimate objective was. Well, what happens in this further destabilized region is you have the rise of ISIS, or also referred to as ISIL. This is a direct result of the instability in the nation of Iraq. Saddam Hussein, he was a thug, he was a tyrant, no doubt about that. The problem, however, you sweep aside one of these dictators, you're going to have another 11, 12, 15, 39 lined up right behind him. Nightmare, headache, headache, headache. Remember that as you're going to sleep tonight, you'll probably hear me, ah! Well, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, also known as ISIL, the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, which is a region here of Eastern Syria and Western Iraq. It came forth from this organization of Al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2004. Its original leader, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, was killed in 2006. The new leader here is Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, and I want you to listen and listen close, okay? The amount of attention that this pathetic group of cold-blooded murderers gets is ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. It doesn't mean that we're not going to get hit in another terrorist strike. Oh yeah, I'd say it's coming. You're not going to lose to these cowards. Put this in its proper perspective. Okay, the CIA, of course, it's actually down to about 19,000 miles, square miles that they control. About half the amount is then. The CIA will say they have about 20 to 25,000 soldiers. Who are they? They're formal soldiers, for the most part, of Saddam Hussein, who were looking for work basically after the war, and they couldn't join the Iraqi military because they weren't simply allowed to. So they go into this area, it's lightly populated, there's chaos, there's instability. And the Cold War, 1980, the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact nations could field a fighting force of 7 million soldiers across Eastern Europe in 1980 in our lifetimes. 7 million soldiers. That's a whole bunch. ISIS, we'll even give them the higher end, 25,000 soldiers. It's pathetic. What is so annoying for me is the standpoint that the amount of attention that Osama bin Laden, this pathetic coward with an ego the size of Mount Everest, when he wasn't getting enough attention, oh, I'm going to put out another VHS tape. Death to Americans, death to Americans. And it would come on the 6 o'clock news. Well, the CIA is still checking to see if it's authentic or not. Who gives a damn? Who cares? I mean, I understand, and I'm not being unsympathetic in any way, shape, or form to the countless Americans who died at the hands of terrorism or to our soldiers who have died fighting this. But the bottom line is you're not going to lose to this, plain and simple. You're not going to lose. And it becomes, as an organization, all the more desperate. Here is in terms of the areas here that it controls. It's led to a Syrian refugee crisis, the greatest humanitarian catastrophe in terms of refugees since the end of World War II. Want to see an excellent film on this? It's very short. It's called 4.1, number 4.1. You can find it on YouTube. And it talks about this Greek town just past here of Lesbos that are dealing with these massive amounts of Syrian refugees, men, women, and children. Nearly 50% of them are children. And in essence, the Arab world basically has ignored them. Canada has taken in some. I think we've only taken like 3,000, if that. Germany's taken 500,000. The European nations have stepped up. And I understand the concern, I understand the fear, so on and so forth. See the film. It's not political. It shows you the plight of these unfortunate souls who are caught here in the crossfire in this ongoing Syrian civil war, as al-Assad, a militaristic autocrat, has been trying to hold desperately on to his power here in this nation. For the United States as a nation, in the present, the question becomes one of what to do. I can remember the Republicans last year, as Ted Cruz was talking about making the sand glow. What is that going to do? What is that going to do? In terms of what the solution is, I don't exactly know. But the problem is, in this region, hopelessly dysfunctional, very unstable. For US foreign policy, and the American government is very, very much aware of this, you need to think not once, not twice, but 3 times in terms of the interventions that you may have, because, of course, these actions always produce a reaction. By the same token, I am an optimist, and I will predict that there will be peace in the Middle East. At some point or another, this long-awaited peace, this stability will happen. And I can also guarantee you that once this region stabilizes for US foreign policy, next, sure as the sun will rise tomorrow, all hell is going to start breaking loose between India and Pakistan. In the words of the great comedian Gilda Radner, in life, it's always something. Thank you so very much. Thank you. Any questions at all? So I tend to, a typical Irish American, I tend to get a little bit worked up and a little long-winded. Oh, question right there. Yes, sir.
Politicians occasionally say we're making progress against terrorism, and then say at some point in the very near future, we're going to defeat terrorism. How do you react to that?
I mean, I think from the standpoint of politicians, or even if you're a member of the U.S. State Department, you remain very optimistic. So it's a case of we're turning the corner, we're making progress, et cetera, et cetera. And sometimes it's difficult to tell. The problem with terrorism is that you're not going to lose, but by the same token, it's very, very difficult to defeat terrorism. And that ends up being the greatest challenge. I mean, you hope to undermine it as best as possible, but it does prove to be, in that regard, a very significant challenge. So, I mean, I think it's something that if I were a politician, Democrat or Republican, I would be saying the same thing. And you have to be critical of the other party. You have to be, because especially if you're the opposition party, it just goes with the term. Not being critical of either party in that regard. That's just pretty much the nature of the beast, as they would say. So, but it becomes tough to basically sort through in terms of what level of progress. And I would say that what's going to happen I'm more concerned with Syria, and I'm more concerned, I mean, if history makes you anything, it makes you a passionate humanitarian. But by the same token, you have to be a realist. And for example, the US government's not going to push on human rights in Egypt and Saudi Arabia. And as a humanitarian, I understand that completely. And as Americans, the problem with us is we're so damn idealistic. Okay? And there's nothing wrong with being idealistic. I always was yelling that at my students in the college classroom, saying, don't ever lose your idealism, which is true. Because but by the same end, it becomes difficult because sometimes you feel like you're in this uphill struggle, looking for a light at the end of the tunnel, and it's tough. And for American foreign policy, one of the biggest problems in the Middle East is when the Americans are there, the attitude is, what the hell are the Americans doing here? And when the Americans aren't there, it's, where the hell are the Americans? You're damned if you do, damned if you don't. Next question. Oh, yes, sir.
Qatar's in the news today because they have the Turks there helping them, protecting them from the Saudis. Qatar is on the Saudis' bad list because they are now becoming friendly with Hamas they met with the Iranians, and they are also friendly with the Russians these days. What do you think is happening there? It looks like a break.
It's tough to say with the nation of Turkey in the present. There's an ongoing issue with the Kurds because the Kurds were looking for their own independent state of Kurdistan after the war. And the Kurds did not get their independent state because the bulk of the Kurds live in Turkey. So the issues here between Turkey and by the same token, Turkey sees itself as being part of Europe, and it's become all the more authoritarian as time has moved on. I'm not optimistic in terms of the issues and the nuances. It's difficult. What happens, I'll go to similar places, and over the course we'll do like series, et cetera. Bjorklund is a classic case example. And I gave up predicting things a long time ago. And the reason being is that I've been wrong 90% of the time. So, but fortunately, people are kind enough to say, well, Tim, you were right on that. I'm like, yes, I was. I could see it on the horizon. Yes, question, ma'am.
So maybe this is idealistic. There's been a loss of career diplomats. There is, in the budget proposal, lots more money for the military, less money for the State Department. Can you reassure us about that?
I would say that the best diplomatic corps, it's something that I would oppose personally. Not more money going to the military. That's always been a central part of US policy, especially going back to the time of the start of the Cold War. I'd say even before that. Certainly in the late 1930s, even before Pearl Harbor, 1939, 1940, it really becomes very, very significant. I would also go so far as to say the best diplomatic corps in the 19th century were the British diplomats. They had it down to an art form. In the 20th century and beyond, I'd say the best diplomatic corps are American diplomats, just because it's something that you're constantly and continually in operation for. And I think the Americans mean very, very well, but at times it can be thankless and it can be a great challenge. I don't agree with cutting back on the State Department at all. I think that's a mistake. I think the movement, or what seems to be a movement towards isolationism, it's not possible. It is simply not possible. It can't happen. Oh, yes, it looks nice on paper. But at the end of the day, it simply is out of the question. Yes, sir. Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. My question is, you don't believe that Saddam sent his weapons of mass destruction to Syria while we were preparing our shock and awe?
What I would say is from the standpoint of Saddam Hussein, with chemical and biological weapons, if you can go back to the time of the Iran-Iraq War, in a movement of desperation in 1988, he unleashes here a chemical attack. You probably remember that from the news clippings long before the Persian Gulf War, on Halabja. Halabja was a Kurdish village that was rising in open rebellion here. I mean, basically what he was dealing with was a war against Iran in the Iran-Iraq War, but also a low-grade civil war with the Shiites who represent the majority of the population in Iraq, and the Kurdish population, trying to control them. So it was kind of like a double whammy in that regard, trying to control matters. And there were reports, I can remember Colin Powell, for example, before the UN, talking about, oh, there they go, with the weapons being sent, et cetera, et cetera. From what the claim was, and hiding what was going to be this large array, I don't think it was possible. By the same token, you can justify any war in the modern era, or in history for that matter, with the following. You are being invaded, you are going to be invaded, or you might be invaded at some point down the road. And so, I mean, you can use that right on across the board. And if you think about it, and again, from the standpoint of more people have died in the 20th century, we're on this journey is so incredibly fragile. It's so unbelievably short that the ties that bind us together are far more significant across the board than the divisions. So I think a lot of it was, I mean, eventually the Bush administration came along to the fact, and I'm not blaming George W. Bush and his administration for ISIS, but I'm saying these actions produce reactions. And when you're stepping into an unstable situation and making it more unstable, you have to pick your battles wisely. And what are those battles that should be chosen wisely? Well, that's the million-dollar question. I saw another hand over here.
Last question.
Tom Friedman, the New York Times, a couple of years ago did a documentary on education in the Gaza Strip, talked in terms of the teaching of hate to the young children, and we looked at many generations of these children growing up with that built-in hate. Living out there, how do you see the situation?
It's an excellent question, and a very good question. Basically, knowing many Palestinians and many Israelis, far more Israelis actually, it is something that's very, very troubling. And it's not just in Gaza, it's in Saudi Arabia, it's in parts of Jordan as well, in the West Bank. And in essence, it's a demonization of the other. Now, a classic example of that, the birth of modern anti-Semitism has European foundations, 1879. And you can take it actually all the way back to Christian anti-Judaism, all the way back to biblical times, of the Jews as Christ killers, the Jews as ritual murderers. Well, with the onset of the Enlightenment, and you have all sorts of demonization and victim, the Jews are going to be beaten up and killed during the Spanish Inquisition, the accusation of ritual murder, which they believe they drained during the time of Easter. Christian boys and girls drained their blood for their bizarre ritual sacrifice. It was just absolute trash. The Enlightenment in Europe brought the stress that wasn't true. They didn't really kill Christ, and they're not ritual murders, and they weren't responsible for the Black Death. But what morphs over from that is the Jew and his love of money and power, which is also just a bunch of BS. And this becomes this modern example, which continues on in terms of the longest hatred, as it's oftentimes referred to as. In the aftermath of World War II, with the birth of the nation of Israel, much of the anti-Semitism, which was always the worst in Europe, is exported from Europe to the Middle East. What makes me an optimist is that Jews and Muslims got on actually very, very well. Jews and Arabs got on fine in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And if you can solve this problem, and a two-state solution would solve that, and it's really going to be a three-state solution, because you're going to have Hamas, you're going to have, quite frankly, Hamas is going to be in charge of Gaza, which is the most densely packed region in the entire world, easily outdistancing any part of China. The West Bank will be dominated by Al-Fatah, which is a political arm of the PLO. So it's going to be more of a three-state solution, and then you'll have Israel. That can be done because in India, you had West Pakistan and East Pakistan, or what is present-day Pakistan and Bangladesh. So you had Bangladesh and Pakistan were Muslim states, India is a Hindu state, it'll be a similar situation there. So it is something that's very, very troubling to see, and some of the things that I'll hear as a modern Jewish historian traveling around the Middle East, and Europe for that matter, are very, very striking. And I'm not Jewish. But it's something that, as my interest in the Holocaust, went back to the stage that it made absolutely zero sense. Like I'm having a seminar on it, The Jesuits taught us all about it. Hell, going back to Catholic grade school in Milwaukee, we saw films on liberation of concentration camps. This is post-Vatican II. His sisters taught us all about it. I can remember the Jesuits at a seminar, and I remember thinking to myself, this makes absolutely zero sense. It wasn't just Jews. You had other undesirables, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, Soviet POWs. And the list just goes on and on and on and on. Hitler's Germany came closer than human beings have ever come to creating hell on earth in the backdrop of the Second World War. So in 1987, I became all the more obsessed with it, and it's depressing as hell. I'm oftentimes asked why I don't do it publicly. Well, it's not exactly uplifting. Of course, you could say the same thing about this. But by the same end, I was convinced in 1987 I'd figure it all out. And to this stage now, decades later, I'm more confused by it than ever. And it continues to happen. ISIS in the present day with the Yazidis. And I was off with Georgetown University and students from Seton Hill in March, and we were going to mass graves, discovering new mass graves of the Einsatz group and here off in these villages in Belarus, in the middle of nowhere. And now you can tell mass graves because exactly you can tell the way people were buried. And with equipment you can tell in terms, because the rule of thumb was 1 bullet for every Jew. The majority of them died from the effects of starvation or were gassed at Treblinka and Auschwitz elsewhere. But 1.8 million were shot in the back of the head. And to hear these stories and these testimonies from many people now who were eyewitnesses in these small villages outside of Minsk and Brest and elsewhere in Belarus, as well as through Ukraine, etc. It's horrible. The example here of man's inhumanity to his fellow man, it can die a happy little historian when we see ourselves as being tied together in this journey. And that's a warning to me. Tied together here, tied together collectively, recognizing the commonality that we all share as opposed to our obvious differences. Thank you so very much. Best wishes to all. Thank you. Any other questions? Come on up.